The plasma storms over Caridian 7 painted the sky in violent shades of crimson and gold, casting twisted shadows across the battlefield, where Commander Zephyr Callens of the Nexari Coalition crouched behind the twisted remains of what had once been their orbital defense platform. Her bioarmor sparked with each impact from Vorthak energy weapons, the alien invaders pressing forward with the methodical precision of a species that had conquered 14 star systems in as many cycles. "Status report," she barked into her comm, ducking as another pulse cannon blast turned the metal barrier beside her into molten slag. "Perimeter holding on sectors 4 through 9, came the strained voice of Lieutenant Orion Vex. "But barely. We've lost the eastern grid entirely." Zephyr's mandibles clicked in frustration, a Nexari expression of barely contained rage. 3 months since the Vorthak hegemony had descended upon their outer colonies like a plague of steel and fury. The Coalition had called for aid from every ally, every treaty partner, every species that owed them favors, or feared what would happen if the Vorthak weren't stopped here. The response had been disappointing. Ma'am, her communications officer, Specialist Talon Grimm, looked up from his console with hollow eyes. Another rejection came through. The Zeltans cite logistical complications. The Corinth Empire is reviewing strategic priorities. Zephyr's laugh was bitter as another explosion rocked their position. "Reviewing priorities? While we bleed out on this rock?" She peered over the barrier at the advancing Vorthak warriors. 8 feet tall, chitinous armor gleaming like oil, weapons that could melt through starship hulls. "What about the humans?" Talon's expression grew puzzled. "Humans? Ma'am, they're barely a Tier 2 civilization. Primitive industrial base, minimal fleet presence. They only joined the Coalition 18 months ago. They have ships, they have weapons." Zephyr watched another squad of her warriors fall back under overwhelming fire. "At this point, I'd take help from space pirates." Their response was unusual, Talon admitted, pulling up the transmission log. No formal rejection, no diplomatic excuse. Just one word: acknowledged. Before Zephyr could respond, the ground beneath them trembled. Not from weapons fire. This was different, deeper. Like the planet itself was holding its breath. Above them, the plasma storms began to part. "What the void is that?" Lieutenant Vex whispered. His voice carried over the comm from his position 3 clicks north. Zephyr raised her enhanced optics skyward and felt her dual hearts skip a beat. The sky was opening, not like a portal or dimensional rift, but as if reality itself was being carefully, surgically torn apart by invisible hands. Then they came through. Human warships emerged from what their species called jump space, but not the crude, energy-wasteful version the Coalition had observed in their diplomatic files. These ships materialized with the precision of a surgeon's blade, each vessel positioning itself with geometric perfection across Caridian 7's sun's orbital plane. "Sweet ancestors," Talon breathed. "How many are there?" Zephyr counted quickly, then counted again. 47. No, 52. More are still coming through. The ships were unlike anything in the Coalition database. Where Nexari vessels were elegant curves and flowing lines, and Vorthak ships were brutal angles and spikes, these human craft were something else entirely. They were sleek, yes, but with an understated menace, like predators that didn't need to bare their teeth to be feared. "Ma'am," her tactical officer, Sergeant Blaze Corrin, looked up from his instruments with wide eyes. "I'm reading energy signatures I've never seen before. These ships, they're not just advanced, they're operating on principles our physics can't explain." The lead human vessel, a sleek destroyer painted in matte black with silver accents, opened a channel. The voice that emerged was calm, almost conversational, but there was something underneath it that made Zephyr's combat-hardened nerves tighten. "Nexari Coalition Forces, this is Captain Phoenix Reacher of the Terran Defense Initiative vessel. Silent Thunder, we received your distress call." Zephyr grabbed her comm unit. "Captain Reacher, this is Commander Callens. We didn't expect a response?" The human's voice carried a hint of something that might have been amusement. "We're full of surprises. Recommend you pull your people back to minimum safe distance. We're about to demonstrate why humans don't leave their friends to die alone. Captain, with respect, the Vorthak have orbital superiority, ground-based particle cannons, and Commander. The voice was still calm, but now there was steel beneath the silk. Pull, back. Something in that tone made Zephyr's survival instinct scream a warning. All units, fall back to secondary defensive positions. Emergency withdrawal. Authorization, Callan 7-7. Ma'am, the eastern positions will be overrun if we... Now, Lieutenant. As coalition forces scrambled to retreat, the human fleet began to move. Not with the thunderous engine flares of conventional drives, but with an eerie, almost supernatural grace. They descended through the atmosphere like falling stars, but stars that could think, that could choose their path. The Vorthak, recognizing a new threat, turned their ground-based weapons skyward. Massive particle cannons designed to crack the hulls of capital ships swiveled to track the incoming human vessels. They fired. The beams struck the human ships dead on and simply stopped. Not deflected by shields, not absorbed by armor. The energy just ceased to exist the moment it touched the human hulls. What kind of defensive technology? Zephyr whispered. It's not defense. Captain Reacher's voice came through the comm, still maddeningly calm. It's conversion. Your enemies just gave us more power to work with. What happened next would be talked about in coalition military academies for centuries to come. The human ships didn't fire weapons in any conventional sense. Instead, they released something that could only be described as controlled physics. Gravity wells appeared and disappeared at will, crushing Vorthak ground positions into spheres of compressed matter. Electromagnetic pulses, tuned to specific molecular frequencies, turned enemy vehicles into clouds of constituent atoms. And through it all, not a single shot went astray. Not one burst of energy touched coalition forces or civilian structures. Surgical doesn't begin to describe it, Sergeant Corrin reported, his voice filled with awe. They're fighting a three-dimensional battle across orbital, atmospheric, and ground levels simultaneously. The tactical coordination required for this is impossible, Lieutenant Vex finished. By every model we have, this level of battlefield awareness should be impossible for any single species to achieve. But the humans weren't finished. As the orbital battle raged, something else was happening on the ground. Zephyr's long-range sensors detected movement in the areas where Vorthak forces had been thickest. But instead of the expected alien signatures, she was seeing something new. Human soldiers, on foot, in the middle of a battle zone where the very air was still crackling with residual energy. How did they get troops planetside so fast? Talon asked. The answer came from an unexpected source. One of the human ground troops opened a direct channel to Zephyr's command post. The voice was young, female, but carried an authority that made seasoned coalition veterans straighten unconsciously. Commander Callens, this is Lieutenant Raven Blackwood, Terran Special Operations. We need to talk. Lieutenant, how did you... Our sensors show no dropships, no insertion pods. We came down the hard way, Blackwood interrupted. Listen carefully. The Vorthak aren't just here for conquest. They're testing something. A new weapon system designed specifically to counter coalition defensive doctrines. Zephyr's blood chilled. How do you know this? Because we've been watching, for months. Ever since they started their expansion, we've had assets tracking their movements, analyzing their tactics, learning their weaknesses. The human's voice grew cold. They made one mistake. They assumed we were just another primitive species. They didn't realize we've been preparing for this fight since before they knew we existed. On the horizon, explosions lit up the sky as the last Vorthak strongholds were systematically dismantled. But what struck Zephyr wasn't the destruction, it was the precision. Not one civilian building had been touched. Not one coalition defensive position had been damaged by stray fire. Your tactics, she said slowly. This level of coordination, this technology. How long have you been preparing for war? Ma'am, Blackwood's voice carried a note that might have been sadness. Humans don't prepare for war. We prepare for survival. And sometimes those two things look exactly the same. As the battle wound down, Captain Reacher's ship descended to the surface, landing with the same impossible grace it had displayed in orbit. The captain himself emerged from an airlock that seemed to bend light around its edges. A tall, lean figure in form-fitting armor that looked more like liquid metal than traditional battle gear. Zephyr met him at the improvised landing zone, flanked by her surviving officers. Up close, she could see that Reacher's armor wasn't just advanced. It was integrated with his nervous system, responding to his thoughts as if it were part of his body. "Commander," he said, removing his helmet to reveal sharp features and eyes that seemed older than his apparent age. "Apologies for the delay. We were occupied with some housekeeping." "Delay?" Zephyr couldn't keep the incredulity from her voice. "Captain, you just dismantled an entire Vorthak invasion force in under 3 hours. That's not a delay. That's a miracle." Reacher's expression darkened. "It wasn't a miracle, Commander. It was a message. To whom? To anyone else who thinks humanity's allies are acceptable casualties." He gestured to the smoking ruins of what had been Vorthak forward positions. "We don't abandon our friends. We don't calculate acceptable losses when people who trust us are dying. And we really don't like bullies." Lieutenant Blackwood approached from the battlefield, her armor stained with alien ichor, but her posture alert and professional. "Captain, perimeter secured. No Vorthak survivors. Minimal coalition casualties. The weapon prototypes they were testing have been secured for analysis." "Excellent work, Lieutenant." Reacher turned back to Zephyr. "We'll be leaving a small task force in system for cleanup operations. Consider it a gift from Earth to the Coalition." "Captain," Zephyr found herself struggling with words. "Why? Your species could have ignored our call like everyone else. You had no obligation." "Commander," Reacher's voice was quiet but firm. "In human culture, there's an old saying, the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. We decided a long time ago that we wouldn't be the species that did nothing." As the human fleet prepared to depart, Zephyr stood on the command tower's rebuilt observation deck, watching ships that had redefined her understanding of warfare prepare to slip back into whatever realm they'd emerged from. "Ma'am," Talon approached, carrying a data pad. "Preliminary analysis of the human weapon systems is, well, it's impossible." "Define impossible." "They're not using technology as we understand it. It's like they've found a way to make the universe itself follow their commands. Matter conversion, gravity manipulation, localized time dilation. These aren't just advanced sciences. They're applications of physics we didn't know existed." Zephyr nodded slowly. "What about their fleet strength? How many ships does Earth actually have?" Talon's expression grew troubled. "That's just it, ma'am. According to Coalition intelligence, they should have maybe 20 vessels capable of interstellar warfare. But what we saw today was 52 ships demonstrating capabilities that could have handled 10 times the Vorthak force we faced." Zephyr finished. "Which means either our intelligence is completely wrong, or they've been hiding their true capabilities since the day they joined the Coalition." As if summoned by their conversation, Captain Reacher's voice crackled through the comm system one final time. "Commander Callens, a final word of advice. When you file your report with Coalition Command, you might want to mention that humanity takes its friendship seriously, very seriously. The species that chose not to answer your call for help, they might want to reconsider their priorities." "Captain," Zephyr keyed her comm, "are you threatening Coalition members?" "Not threatening, Commander. Educating. There's a difference." A pause. "The Vorthak invaded your space because they believed you were isolated, vulnerable, abandoned by fair-weather allies. They were wrong about the abandoned part. They won't make that mistake again. And the species that refused to help will have to live with the knowledge that they let good people die because it wasn't convenient to care." Reacher's voice carried a note of finality. "Humans have long memories, Commander. We remember who stands with us, and we remember who doesn't." The transmission ended, leaving Zephyr staring at the sky as the human fleet began to fade from sensors. Not departing, but somehow becoming undetectable, as if they'd learned to hide in the spaces between reality. 3 days later, reports began flooding in from across Coalition space. The Zeltans, who had cited logistical complications, found their primary trade routes mysteriously disrupted by navigational anomalies. The Corinth Empire, still reviewing strategic priorities, discovered that their diplomatic communications were experiencing unprecedented delays and errors. Meanwhile, species that had sent aid, even token support, reported unexpected benefits. Trade agreements were honored ahead of schedule. Scientific data appeared in their databases. Technological upgrades were discovered in their systems, improvements that would have taken decades to develop independently. They're reshaping the galaxy's political landscape, Lieutenant Vex observed during a staff meeting. Without firing a shot at coalition members, they're making it clear that there are consequences for abandoning allies. And rewards for loyalty, Zephyr added. It's not conquest, it's correction. In the weeks that followed, as Caridian 7 was rebuilt and fortified, Zephyr often found herself staring at the memorial erected for the fallen. Human engineers working alongside coalition construction crews had insisted on including a small addition to the monument, a simple plaque that read, "In memory of those who stood, in honor of those who came, in warning to those who would stand by and watch good people die." The galactic political map began to shift. Species that had previously calculated their alliances based on convenience and profit suddenly found themselves facing a new variable. What would the humans think? Trade routes were rerouted to favor those who had answered the call for aid. Research partnerships blossomed between Earth and species that had shown courage in dark times. And slowly, carefully, certain species found themselves increasingly isolated, not through military action, but through the simple application of consequences. Captain Reacher had been right. Humans did have long memories. 6 months after the Battle of Caridian 7, Zephyr received an encrypted message from an unknown source. When she decrypted it, she found a single line of text. "Thank you for giving us a reason to believe the galaxy still has heroes worth protecting. A friend." She never discovered who sent it, but she suspected she knew. The message was followed by detailed intelligence on 3 different hostile species that had been planning attacks on Coalition space. Intelligence so comprehensive and accurate that it could only have come from surveillance networks beyond anything the Coalition possessed. Humanity, Zephyr realized, hadn't just responded to their call for help. They had been watching, waiting, ready to act the moment good people needed them. And somewhere in the dark between the stars, she knew they were still watching. The galaxy had learned something important. Some storms don't announce themselves with thunder. Some storms arrive in silence, with precision, carrying names like Silent Thunder and Storm's End. They come not to conquer, but to correct, not to rule, but to remind. And when they leave, the sky is always clearer than before. Years later, when coalition military academies taught the Battle of Caridian 7, they would focus on the tactics, the technology, the impossible precision of human warfare. But the real lesson was simpler. In a galaxy full of fair-weather friends and calculated alliances, humanity had chosen to be the species that came when called, and they had made that choice not because it was profitable, not because it was easy, but because it was right. The storm Earth brought wasn't made of wind or rain. It was made of kept promises. And for those who stood with humanity, it was the most beautiful storm they had ever seen. For those who had turned away when help was needed, well, they learned that some storms never truly end. They just move on to the next place where they're needed, leaving behind a sky that remembers everything. The last entry in Commander Zephyr Callan's personal log read simply, "Today I learned that the galaxy's newest species might also be its oldest souls. They came not because they were strong, but because they were kind, and perhaps that's what real strength has always been." In the vast darkness of space, where civilizations rose and fell like waves against an infinite shore, humanity had chosen to be the lighthouse. And the light they cast was the kind that never went out. End of story.